Welcome to CivilNet. This is your host, Eric Hacopian, and we're once again honored to have as our guest Professor Georgi Derluguian. And today we're going to have a discussion about the culture of the post-war period and more precisely the cultural geography of the region that we're in. Professor, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
My first question is, this is in directly regards to Armenia. Right after the war ended, there was a moment which I call we could have had the totalitarian temptation. It would not have been unimaginable in a country like Armenia for a strong man, a group of strong men, or some kind of a military figure or a collective military figure to have taken over the country based on the defeat in the war and the political crisis that was going on in the country. And that simply didn't happen. Why is that? Is it because our totalitarians don't have credibility? Two, is it because our culture is inherently anti-authoritarian and isn't going to, bend very easily to this kind of tendency? Or is it a combination of the two?
Wonderful, thank you very much. In sociology, we joke in methodology classes that fire investigators have three reasons for every fire. They can be electrical, caused by electricity, they can be chemical, or they can be unknown reason, both of the above. Everything else. I doubt that any totalitarian or dictatorial regime depends on the personality. They produce their personalities. Actually, if you look carefully into the histories, before the age of 29, Adolf Hitler was not remarkable for anything in his life. What was remarkable was precisely that he was so unremarkable. There is very little about Stalin before, say, collectivization in 1929, 1930, that would betray, who would he become later. Trotsky, who knew him intimately in the 1920s, who was an enemy, wrote about him just as a bureaucrat, a gray spot, but he never wrote about Stalin as megalomaniac or anything. So regimes produce their rulers. Now, what produces the regime then? Look around the world. In the 21st century, how many totalitarian regimes actually do you have? Think of the past. It was a moment in the 20th century after World War I. World War I created not just one genocide, many, and it created the means for future genocides, and to some extent many different states grabbed those means. Nowhere genocidal, don't think about it, that the United States meant to exterminate the Japanese, but when the panic broke out in late 1941 in the United States, the US government took just a few weeks to create concentration camps, as you know. So these are kind of the levers of 20th century state which were available. That answers the question about Armenia in part. Just the state is too ruined, to have a dictatorship. So for better or for worse, it's not strong enough. But there is, as you pointed out, there is something anti-authoritarian in the Armenian culture. And there we can only venture hypotheses, because it's very difficult to prove such things. We are speaking about ethnic mentalities, so first of all immediately emerges the question, do they exist? Are all Germans very punctual and organized as they're portrayed, or Japanese? So the ethnic stereotypes, they apply to some extent. They are somewhat predictable, and that's why humans go by them, and they always get very surprised when they discover otherwise, because it happens. Now, Armenians are specific in having lost their military elites, their warrior elites, still in the Middle Ages. Armenia would look very much like Georgia, probably, had they preserved their Naharar elite, so there is no nobility. So Armenians, at the formative period, 19th century, when modern nations were emerging, because modern communications emerged, the modern markets, people became aware of the much bigger world. At that time, Armenians were basically a nation of shoemakers and priests. Because that's what, and shoemakers could be rich, as you know, they could become entrepreneurial. However, this was fundamentally a nation without warrior nobility, like many other nations in Europe, or for that matter, like Turkey. And there were very few bureaucrats, if at all. There were merchants, there were shoemakers, and there were priests. Priests commanded very special respect for intellectualism, which was inherited and partly taken away from priests by their children who became intellectuals. So Armenians, especially in Soviet times, boasted extraordinary number of world-class intellectuals. And I suspect that there is something to it, that any Communist Party ruler in Soviet Armenia knew that he exists in the small space with the likes of Aram Khachaturian or the chess champion, Tigran Petrosyan. Yeah. And here, let me finish just with a joke. It's a real life story that the great Armenian animator, I actually don't know how many people say in diaspora would even know that Armenia used to have some of the most advanced and best animation in the world during the 1970s, 1980s. So when Rob Sahakyants, who was a refugee from Baku himself and lived in Yerevan, in the late 1970s, produced a cartoon, an animated film, which looked very much like the Yellow Submarine. It was kind of psychedelic. The Communist Party officials wanted to shelve it, because it was just weird. It was strange, and the director of Armen Film Studio said, "Oh, get out! Last time you talked me into shelving a film. In the end, it proved out to be the genius of Parajanov. I'm not going to do it again."
Well, we're glad he didn't. The second question I'm going to move on to is, there's a lot of conversation now about the Caucasus as a whole. And I know you've said this previously, that the Caucasus region, at least economically in many ways, it only works as a collective. Individually, those parts are not particularly relevant. It only works as a collective. And this is talked about in the context of these possible rail and road links that are being set up or could be set up. But when I look at the three countries in this region, the three primary countries in this region, and when you look at their political development, and in some ways their cultural development, and you can make the case that they're actually moving in different directions. You can make the case that Georgia and Armenia, in their own strange, slow, methodical way, are moving towards some forms of localized democracy and some forms in which people themselves have agency and they're not subjects, they're citizens. While at the same time, when you look at Azerbaijan, it is becoming far more of a Middle Eastern type state, as you have stated before yourself. A sultanate, I believe you referred to it. And what's interesting is because Azerbaijan used to be, in some ways, one of the most advanced Muslim, states in the world. In 1918, I think they gave women the right to vote before Americans did. How do you see this? Am I accurate? And then what does this really mean? How can you, tie this world together when they appear to be moving in different directions?
It's always the question of time frame. So it's a very common mistake in prognostication is to take what has been happening for the last 10 or 20 or 50 years and extrapolate to the next 20 or 30 years. I hope we might be wrong here, that what happened in 1991 was not just the liberation. Liberation, when your prison walls collapse and you suddenly realize that you're naked and the wind is blowing. It was a terrible moment in the 1990s at the same time, exhilarating but terrible. Nobody expected it at the time, and it is actually very indicative in how different directions the Caucasus peoples went. They fell back on what was there in their ethnic traditions. As the great Russian anthropologist Sergei Arutyunov who is actually an ethnic Armenian from Tbilisi, whose first language was Georgian rather than Armenian. Later he learned 20 other languages. He once joked, observed wisely, that when electricity suddenly goes off in your home, you have to go into the barn and reach for the old kerosene lamp of your grandfather. So this is what happened, in the Caucasus. And in the Caucasus, you must remember, there is the North Caucasus, which is part of Russia. There is Dagestan and Chechnya. And by the way, the earliest mentioning of Chechen people probably is in the 7th century AD Armenian geography, Ashkharatsuits, which mentions the people called Nokhchimatyan, and the Chechens call themselves Nokhche. It has been very interdependent and very interpenetrated for a long time, in part thanks to Armenian diaspora, who were present all over the place. To remind you, what began happening at the turn of 20th century, 120 years ago, was the kind of unmixing of populations, because during World War I, ethnic divisions emerged because Russian Imperial Army at the time, but so many other armies were desperate to recruit anyone willing to fight. And if people were willing to fight as Armenians, and many Armenians take pride, say in Andronik and others, they formed ethnic units within still the imperial armies. The empires promised something, to the local nations, and it suddenly dawned on provincial, local, middle-class people, that, hey, I'm just an accountant here or a teacher at school. I could be a member of the National Academy of Sciences. I could be a member of National Parliament. And people would no longer, I would not feel any longer at any disadvantage that I speak English or French or Russian with a local accent. I would be very proudly speaking my language. And of course, you need to explain that to your peasants, that we are your elite. And this is what began happening during the Russian Civil War. So suddenly, in 1917, Russian government disappeared. And then Ottoman government also disappeared, 2 years later. And it was complete mayhem, as we know, but also, glorious mayhem. When nations began separating, there were very strange instances when, for instance, independence of Armenia, very few people realize, that the independence of Armenia was proclaimed in the capital of Georgia, in Tbilisi, on this very same day as independence of Azerbaijan. Why? Because both Armenians and Azerbaijanis were booted out by what was becoming in 1918 the new Georgian government. And they had nowhere to go at the time because Baku was a communist republic led by Armenians at the time. And because in Yerevan there were actually few Armenians because it was a backwater, there was nothing to do for good Armenians. In Yerevan there were many more Armenians in Tbilisi, what was becoming capital of Georgia. This might look almost ironic. Long, it's not a case. So Georgia is becoming more and more mono-ethnic, especially with the separation of their fringes. Mm-hmm. Azerbaijan managed actually to impose Azerbaijani identity. So I remember, one of my colleagues, who did research in the villages around Karabakh, in Azerbaijani villages, late in the 1980s, just before the war, says that he met the people who would say, yeah, my grandmother and grandfather were Kurds, but of course I'm Azeri. Something like, and in Armenia, more or less the same happened, with lots of people arriving here, making Yerevan look very Armenian, feel Armenian, becoming very Armenian. So you have the emergence of three nations in these places, and these three nations in the 1990s have resumed on their kerosene lamps, whatever they had in storage. And so Georgians had their democratic republic. Azerbaijan also had a democratic republic, but it broke down in part because they were losing the war. It was complete mayhem, because they also lost in the ethnic cleansings of the early 1990s, in late 80s. Azerbaijan lost not only its Armenians, it lost many ethnic Russians, Jews, Poles, there were ethnic Poles, Germans, so there were lots of people, who were urban, middle class or professionals, they left the country, and people from villages invaded the city. So it is actually a very painful but important question. What happened to all those apartments where Armenians used to live in Baku? So they were occupied. By whom? There used to be, 250,000 people in Baku alone. So we see, the catastrophic change in the populations. Also in Yerevan, by the way, less so, because those were mostly Armenians from villages who moved as the urban Armenians moved to Los Angeles, for instance, to Moscow. But you saw everywhere a certain collapse of cultural levels, educational levels, production levels, and the question is, are we going to regain that? And it's good that you mentioned, Azerbaijan was the first constitutional republic in the Muslim world. They produced the first comic opera in the Muslim world. There were many things about which Azeris should be proud. And it's a bitter, very bitter irony, that we have to remind ourselves and Azerbaijanis that they used to have that, and they also have still today such great writers as Akram Aylisli, who wrote The Stone Dreams, the novel which was vilified in Azerbaijan. If you open this novel, and I very much recommend it, The Stone Dreams, you would understand immediately why it was vilified. But I sometimes envy Azerbaijan, that they have such writers.
Well, I'm going to do a corollary question, because you talked about Azerbaijan a great deal, and in the last couple of weeks we've seen this horrendous display in this, I'll call it the hate park in Baku, which is truly an embarrassment, in which they have stereotypes of flat-headed Armenians with big noses that is essentially right out of Rosenberg's anti-Jewish propaganda in World War, in the Nazi period. And obviously it's not a free society, so no one can really object, but what needs to happen to you culturally for that to be acceptable? Especially, what does it say about you that after you win a victory, this happens? The Georgians lost the war to the Russians in 2008. There's no such display of Russians in Tbilisi. The Armenians won the war in the early 90s. There was no such displays of Azeris or this kind of wretched ugliness. Where does this come from, and how is this justified?
Well, obviously inferiority complex. But again, let's not generalize. You just mentioned it. It's a very unfree society. What is remarkable, if you follow, I do with shudder, but I do follow Azerbaijani newspapers, at least in Russian, is that there are no war heroes.
There's only one.
Side. Yeah, there is one.
Yeah.
And he speaks about himself in first singular. I did, so he did everything, well, maybe his wife was at his side. This, by the way, makes the regime look not only ludicrous, but vulnerable, because it has no plan B and no second in command, no third in command. This is why I say it's very wrong, to call it fascist. And I think, it's not a junta. And a junta means a council, after all. It's a sultanism. It's a specific term from sociology. This is the regime, where everything belongs and is focused on one man. So obviously, that park is so ugly that, in a sense, it's wonderful. Because it cannot say it. Can you imagine that park outliving Ilham Aliyev? What happens to that? And it's a good question, of course, for political scientists, who can predict, how long would Ilham last in his position. Again, we know from a lot of experience at world scale, that such sultanistic regimes appear very granite-like while they last. They're hollow from inside, and they can collapse with surprising rapidity. And there is a lot of dust. So the hope is that not everything is dead in that society. It's very traumatized, It was traumatized by the humiliating defeat against Armenians. You have to realize, that the attempt to create Azeri nationalism in 20th century was very difficult to base because, okay, what do you have? Language, but language is too much like Turkish. Culture, but it's too much like Iranian culture. There is no historical epic of resistance so what typically, goes into national pride? Historical epic of resistance to foreign invasion, there is none. That's why Azerbaijan tried, to appropriate, something from Sasanian times, their medieval classical poets, who wrote in Persian, of course, proclaimed early Azerbaijani and so forth. So there were lots of difficulties. All right, there are many such instances. The Irish predominantly speak English, who were the oppressors. The United States, they speak English. This doesn't make them British any longer. So Azerbaijan could have based their nationalism or national pride on some success story, but there was none. So everything that remained, or all that remained, was great Haydar Aliyev, not Ilham, but his father, who was very important actually. He was the other Gorbachev. He could have been anti-Gorbachev. He was young, or relatively young for the Soviet leadership. He was ruthless, he was outspoken, he was fearsome. So people really used to fear and they pit in his presence, because he was a dragon, as they used to call him. The son, from what we hear, colloquially is called, baby camel. So he is not at all like his father, and that's why he needed to do kind of lots of posturing. And with this despicable park, we see that he went overboard, and this is the problem with such regimes, because they create the echo chamber of their own propaganda. When you read Azerbaijani official, and they are all official websites and newspapers, one wonders actually, to whom is it intended? Who is going to read this? So many of these things are totally ritualistic propaganda phrases, very much like North Korean or something you find in Central Asia. So this is frightening, but there is hope that it's so despicable, that it cannot last.
Thank you, that was wonderful. I'm going to ask you, we just went through April 24th, and this year we had the development of the President of the United States for the first time using the famous G word. You can argue how relevant or irrelevant that is. The one thing that came out of it was the complete unity of the Turkish body politic outside of the Kurdish and the Kurdish party, the Kurdish leftist party, that all united to take a position of genocide denial that is farcical in the face of facts and frankly laughed at around the world. Why do people? Why did they continue to humiliate themselves like that? I try to put myself in the shoes of an Osman Kavala or a Taner Akem or a Orhan Pamuk. The sort of these righteous Turks, however you want to describe them. Not them, but their views might be only reflecting 5-10% of people. But how humiliating must it be for them to have a country, unlike, for example, there's Russian leaders go to Poland for the Katyn massacre. There's no American, the most wretched American reactionary isn't going to denounce the evils of slavery or segregation. Why do they keep doing this to themselves? Is it because the Armenian genocide was really not the last act of the Ottomans, but actually the first act of the Turkish Republic, that they cannot admit to this? Mm-hmm. Where does this backwardness come from?
Eric, let's not overstate again. First of all, 5 or 10%, it could be more. It had been a freer society, and those even 5% are the best of the Turks, and they know it. The most famous, the influential. This probably has to, and let's not overstate again, say the German or the Russian virtues on that. Because there is, for instance, the very nasty issue of Japan and Korea. Mm-hmm.
Comfort women.
Yeah, comfort women, and there are quite a few of such episodes around the world. There is something puzzling about Ottoman Empire, that empires are often hated, but also admired and nostalgically remembered. There are many people who are nostalgic for Franz Joseph of Austro-Hungary. Right, even Spanish Empire, for all the behavior of Spanish Inquisition or their conquistadors in the New World, there is something about that, to the Spanish grandees. Imperial China, the Mughals, very little of that is remembered about the Ottomans. And I do wonder, actually, why, that they left very little by way of art, mostly decorative art, so there is no fantastic poetry, world-scale poetry, that I know of. What is this? So there was, of course, there were talented people. There was a big achievement, that Ottoman Empire held together simply by 400 years, but there is something which made it very unprestigious at the time. It was the sick men of Europe for way too long to the Turks themselves. To their credit, again, they tried reform time and again, the Tanzimat reforms in almost the entire 19th century. They were trying some kind of reforms and failing, and losing more territory and losing more wars. They came up eventually with such a remarkable figure as Ataturk. And that did not do much difference either. So there is, I suspect, this frustration, why the whole world doesn't like us, including Arabs. They're fellow Muslims, but Arabs always doubted, that Ottoman Sultan could be their overlord. These people don't speak the holy language of the Quran, after all. So in the 20th century, there were very courageous Turks. And I very much recommend, you mentioned luminaries, of course, like Orhan Pamuk, who, by the way, was for a while my colleague back at Northwestern University in Chicago. And I once asked him, so he said on many occasions that the most important classical literature for him was Russian. And I asked him, so in Russian literature, what do you consider? So what do you? So, well, lots of things, but Alexander Herzen, which comes not as the first name to lots of people, it's usually Tolstoyevsky of some kind. Herzen was a Westernizer who lived in London.
And Jewish, right?
No.
He was not? Oh.
No, he was of very high German-Russian origin, very wealthy revolutionary, which allowed him to maintain himself in exile, very comfortably. So Alexander Herzen, he was an illegitimate son. That's why Herz, a child of a heart. Alexander Herzen struggled with being patriotic Russian and yet hating his Asiatic country. So these kind of things, how do you square them? So you want to be a Turk and want to be proud of your country. I recommend, the book by my colleague Ayşe Zarakol. Ayşe teaches international relations at Cambridge. She's Turkish, and she wrote a remarkable book after defeat. So how did Russia, Japan, and Turkey cope with the consequences of the epochal defeat in world wars? So what happens after that? So it's again more complicated than we think. And as to the politics, and it's more hopeful, therefore, but as to the politics of what you observe now, you realize that this is, now, about Turkish Republic today under Erdogan, you can actually say that it's a semi-fascist state. Because there are fascist movements, there are paramilitaries.
They're in the coalition government.
Yes, they're in coalition government, they're killing people, they're behaving very much like black shirts or brown shirts. So there is that element. It's not entirely a consolidated regime, and that's why it's actually so loud. Because each one is wailing loudly, to show to the others that I'm very patriotic. Because if you are like in a pack of wolves, if you are not loud enough, there is the danger, that all the rest will get at your throat. So this is what we observe actually, and this behavior may change very rapidly. We know also again, from history, somebody joked, I think it was in Portugal, nowhere such a vicious regime, of course, but in 1974, after the revolution, the joke was that there are 9 million people living in Portugal, 9.5 million of them are anti-fascists.
I want to come back to Armenia as we're closing up the interview. I have often stated in my shows that we lack a competent or a functional state and a functional economy in many ways, and obviously a functional military. But the one thing that I've always been very loud about is the fact that I think we have a functional culture, in the sense that I think culture has actually kept this country together through other failings. And Mike, there's other cases of countries using their culture to rebuild the country or to build a proper state, a proper economy, and a proper military. How would we go about doing that? Or my assumption correct that our culture is actually functional? And if I'm correct, how would you move forward to creating the 3 other functionalities that we keep talking about?
As we often say in sociology, we know, but it probably might not help, because this is very much like, say, climate. So you know why it is this way, why it gets cold in winter. There are no instances when functional state was created without culture. So it's not in some instances, it's in all instances, because the people who inhabit the state always face the temptation of enjoying the fruits of power, just for the sake of it. And then their politics become very petty politics about who's closer to the feeding trough. The usual intrigue, so the kind of behavior in a pack of male chimpanzees. Which is actually, if you read Deval or you realize that this is quite accurate description for the behavior of certain politicians under certain conditions. Now, how do we obtain other politicians? Not all politicians are like that, not at all times, because there is this sense of duty. And nationalism plays actually a very big role in that, so a sense of duty to the nation, sense of service, so we do it for some higher purpose. We do it as, my wife jokes, that God forbid you die, half of the local bazaar will follow you. because they know you, they know who I am, so I buy groceries and people ask me, how, Yerkirit, how the country is doing. I'm proud of this. So there is a sense of mission. There is also something important about Armenian culture, just again, small anecdote, today. Again, I'm going through the metro in Yerevan with my wife, and there is a woman with a small baby, 2 or 3 years old, a toddler, who is very loudly crying and very annoying in this echo, cavernous metro station. So there are 2 policemen, a man and a woman, Armenian policemen, in masks, of course, who come to this child and ask what's the matter, and the mother says that she's afraid of the train. She never seen the train. So they spent probably 5 minutes until the next train, hushing the baby. The baby was hushed, the train arrived. How often do you expect this behavior from police forces in major metropolises of the world? I'm not going to name or point fingers, but I lived most of my life in the countries where you better avoid the police. So there is something about Armenia in this respect, so I'm very hopeful about it. That also explains to you, why it's actually difficult to build, not even totalitarian, but any kind of dictatorship here, because grannies would frown at you. Old women would call you a Turk. And this is why I think this place is worth investing. In your last comment, Eric, you said, that we're talking not about millions of dollars, but billions. That's a big challenge, Not very many billions, probably, but we need the seed money, and that seed money would have to be in the billions. Why? Because we have actually lots of gifted Armenians, who are ready to come. There are no positions of them in the government apparatus. It's very difficult to transplant them. So this is not so much like physics or chemistry, it's like gardening. So that you can bring, but the soil in Armenia is very rocky. You need to bring also some soil, and you need to allow them to grow roots. So that takes money, because anyone who was successful in the last 100 years, or many more, probably longer, was leaving. There was a short period historically when there was Soviet Armenia, and not everyone was leaving, because first, there was nowhere to go for majority of them, and second, this place was comfortable enough. This is why we got the Soviet Armenia with all its glories. It can be recapitulated, it can be rebuilt. There is good climate, let's put it this way, but the challenge with the diaspora is really, that we need a few $1 billion to start.
Well, Professor, it was a pleasure having you. It was wonderful, and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, it does some good.
This is your host of CivilNet, Eric Hacopian, and thank you for joining us.